I never expected to be alone in that cabin for as long as I was. It was my uncle's place, a small, weathered hunting cabin tucked deep into the thick forests of northern Montana. He built it back in the late 70s, long before I was born, and used it as a getaway spot, somewhere to escape, hunt, fish, and be away from people. I had only been there a handful of times growing up, but I always remembered it as a rough, no-nonsense place. There was no running water, no electricity, just a wood stove, a hand pump well, and a small gas generator that he barely used. When he passed, the cabin sat untouched for years. My family didn't know what to do with it. No one wanted to sell it, but no one wanted to take care of it either. So it sat there, slowly getting swallowed by the woods. Then last year, I decided to go. I was 34, fresh off a nasty breakup, sick of my job, and tired of the city. I thought some time alone in the woods would clear my head. I wasn't planning on staying forever, just a couple of months, long enough to fix up the place and maybe do some hunting. I packed everything I thought I'd need: food, tools, ammo, extra gas for the generator. The drive took nearly 8 hours, and by the time I reached the old logging road that led to the cabin, the sun was setting. The road was worse than I remembered, deep potholes and overgrown branches scraping against my truck. When I finally got there, the cabin looked smaller than I remembered. The roof sagged a little, the porch was covered in leaves, and the windows were thick with dust. But it was still standing. I got out, stretched my legs, and breathed in the cold, pine-scented air. It was quiet, so quiet it made my ears ring. I carried my bags inside and set up my cot near the stove. The place smelled like old wood and dust. There were cobwebs in every corner. Mice had chewed through one of the chair cushions, and the floor creaked under every step. But it was solid. The walls were thick, the locks worked, and the stove still burned hot. That first night, I barely slept. Not because I was scared, just because it was so damn quiet. I was used to city noise, cars, sirens, people. Out here, the silence was like a weight pressing down on me. Every tiny sound, the wind shifting the trees, a branch cracking in the distance, made me snap awake. By the second day, I was already falling into a routine. Wake up early, check the traps, chop wood, clean up around the cabin. I kept my rifle close, but I didn't see anything bigger than a couple of deer. At night, I'd read by lantern light or sit on the porch, listening to the woods. The first week was uneventful. The second week was when things started to change. It was small things at first. One morning, I woke up to find my axe missing. I had left it buried in the chopping block the night before, but now it was gone. I looked around, thinking maybe I had forgotten and brought it inside. Nothing. I found it later, lying about 15 feet into the trees, half buried in the dirt. I told myself it must have been an animal, a raccoon maybe. Then I started hearing noises at night. First, I thought it was just the wind, but the more I listened, the more I realized it wasn't. It was faint, but I could hear something moving outside, slow, deliberate footsteps crunching through the leaves. I sat up in my cot, holding my rifle, waiting. The footsteps would stop, then start again, moving around the cabin. I never saw anything. One night, I finally worked up the nerve to go outside. I took my flashlight and stepped onto the porch. The trees stood still. No wind, no movement. I shined my light around but didn't see anything. Then I heard it, something breathing. It was close, too close. A slow, deep inhale like someone trying not to be heard. I spun, shining my flashlight toward the sound. Nothing, just trees and darkness. My heart was hammering. I backed inside, locked the door, and stayed up the rest of the night. The next morning, I found footprints. Not boot prints.
Bare footprints.
Human. They circled the cabin. Some were pressed deep into the mud, meaning whoever it was had been standing there for a while, just watching. I told myself it was just some drifter, maybe a hunter who had gotten lost. But deep down, I knew that didn't make sense. It was the dead of winter. No one was wandering barefoot through these woods. I started keeping my rifle loaded at all times. That night, it got worse. Around midnight, I heard something new. Not footsteps scraping, like metal dragging against wood. I gripped my rifle and stayed still, listening. The sound was coming from the porch. I waited, every muscle in my body tense. Then, slowly, the door handle started to turn. I aimed at the door, my finger on the trigger. The handle kept twisting, but the lock held. Then the sound stopped. Silence. I waited a full minute before moving. Then, just as I was about to stand, there was a loud bang. Something slammed against the door so hard the whole cabin shook. I nearly pulled the trigger. But then, just as quickly as it started, everything went silent again. I didn't sleep. When dawn broke, I opened the door, rifle in hand. The porch was empty, but my axe was back. It was buried in the middle of the porch, blade down like someone had planted it there. I was done. I packed up everything I could carry and hiked back to my truck. As I started the engine, I glanced at the tree line one last time. That's when I saw him, a man, standing just inside the tree line, barely visible through the branches. He wasn't wearing shoes. His clothes were tattered, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me. I didn't wait. I threw the truck into reverse and tore down that dirt road so fast I nearly lost control. I didn't stop driving until I hit the highway. I never went back. A few months later, my cousin drove up to check on the cabin. He called me after and asked why I had left the place unlocked. I told him I hadn't. But when he got there, the door was wide open. The inside had been ransacked. My cot was shredded, my supplies scattered. But nothing was taken. Nothing except my rifle. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there. But I know one thing for sure. I was never alone in that cabin. And neither is anyone else who goes there. I was driving through the back roads of Oregon when I saw the turnoff to Mark's old cabin. It had been years since I had been out that way, and I wasn't even sure if the place was still standing. Mark had passed away 3 years ago, a freak accident out in the woods. His family had wanted nothing to do with the cabin afterward, and from what I heard, no one had touched it since. Mark and I had grown up together. We met in middle school and had been inseparable ever since. When he bought that cabin, I spent just as much time there as he did. We hunted, fished, and drank whiskey on the porch late into the night. It was our place, our retreat from the world. And then one day he was gone. I hadn't planned on stopping. I had a long drive ahead of me, and I was already running late. But something made me slow down, made me turn onto that narrow dirt road leading into the woods. The road was rough, rutted out by years of rain and neglect. I had to take it slow, dodging potholes and fallen branches as the trees closed in around me. The deeper I went, the worse the road got. It was clear that no one had been up this way in a long time. Grass and weeds had started growing in the tire tracks. The trees leaned in from both sides, their bare branches scraping against my truck. The sun was getting low, and I told myself I would just take a quick look and be on my way before dark. I finally reached the clearing where Mark's cabin stood. The place was in bad shape. The roof sagged in places, and the windows were dark and empty. The porch was covered in leaves and broken branches. It looked abandoned, forgotten. I pulled my truck to a stop but didn't turn it off. Something about the place made my skin crawl. It wasn't just the decay. It was something else, something I couldn't put my finger on. The air was still, too still. No wind, no birds, no sounds at all. I sat there for a moment, debating whether I should get out or just turn around and leave. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold. Footprints, fresh ones, leading from the trees to the front porch. I knew those prints hadn't been there long. It had rained the night before, and the ground was still soft. Someone had been here recently. Maybe they were still here. I felt a prickle of unease crawl up my spine. There was no reason for anyone to be here. The place had been abandoned for years. Mark's family hadn't been up here since his funeral. No one should have been here. I reached under my seat and pulled out my old hunting knife, just in case. Then, against my better judgment, I stepped out of the truck. The silence pressed in around me as I moved toward the cabin. The footprints led right up to the front door, but there were no signs of forced entry. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open with the toe of my boot and stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and rot. Dust hung in the beams of sunlight filtering through the broken windows. The furniture was covered in a thick layer of dust, just as it should have been. But the footprints didn't make sense. Someone had walked up to the cabin, but there were no prints inside. That meant they were still out there, watching. I turned back toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel eyes on me, but I couldn't see anyone. The trees stood motionless, the undergrowth undisturbed. I took a slow step onto the porch, scanning the tree line. And then I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the tree line, tall, thin, motionless. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew it was watching me. I took a step back toward my truck, keeping my eyes locked on the figure. It didn't move. It just stood there, silent and still. Then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. I ran for my truck, my hands shaking as I yanked open the door. I didn't waste time looking back. I slammed the truck into reverse, my tires spinning in the dirt as I backed out of the clearing. As I sped down the dirt road, my mind raced. Who or what had been watching me, and why had it been standing outside Mark's cabin? I didn't stop driving until I hit the highway. Even then, I kept looking in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure standing at the edge of the trees. I never went back to that cabin. I never spoke about what I saw, and I never, not for a single second, stopped wondering who else had been out there that night, or if they were still watching. I was 39 years old when I took the job at the cemetery. It wasn't my first choice, but after a rough couple of years bouncing between construction jobs, I needed something steady. My uncle, a man I hadn't spoken to much over the years, had worked maintenance at the cemetery on the outskirts of town for nearly 3 decades. He was retiring and put in a good word for me to take over. I figured it wouldn't be too bad. A quiet job, no boss breathing down my neck, and not many people to deal with. The cemetery wasn't massive, but it had been around for over 100 years. Rows of old headstones, some barely readable, stretched across the land, with a small section reserved for newer graves. A thin tree line bordered the far end, separating the property from the rolling hills beyond. The office was a small, old building near the entrance, where the manager worked during the day. But the real work happened at the maintenance cabin deeper inside the cemetery grounds. The cabin was a squat wooden structure, probably built back in the 50s, with a single door and 2 grimy windows. It was where tools were kept, where the riding mower was stored, and where I'd spend most of my shifts. I was hired for evening shifts mostly, handling maintenance, cutting grass, clearing branches, and checking on the fences. First, it was peaceful. The work wasn't hard. I'd ride the mower, trim the edges, collect fallen branches, and make sure everything was in order. The place emptied out after sunset, and I'd be alone, which suited me just fine. I'd sit in the cabin when I needed a break, listening to the wind move through the trees. It was quiet work, lonely, but quiet. But things started to change after a few weeks. I first noticed it one evening while finishing up some trimming near the far end of the cemetery. The sun had dipped below the hills, and the sky was that deep blue shade just before full darkness. I turned off the trimmer and stretched my arms when I caught sight of something out of the corner of my eye. A man, standing near the tree line. He was far enough away that I couldn't make out his face, but something about him felt off. He stood too still. The way his arms hung at his sides, the way his head was tilted just slightly, it made my stomach twist. I looked away for only a second, just to wipe sweat from my forehead, and when I looked back, he was gone. I scanned the tree line. Nothing. No movement. Just the trees swaying in the wind. It unsettled me, but I told myself it was probably a visitor who'd come in late and left. Maybe a guy taking a walk. The mind plays tricks in the dark, I reminded myself. I finished my work and walked back to the maintenance cabin. By the time I got there, night had fully settled. I put the tools away, locked up, and got in my truck to head home. As I was pulling out, I glanced back through my rearview mirror. A shadow, near the cabin. I slammed the brakes, my heart lurching into my throat. But when I turned to look properly, there was nothing there. I didn't sleep well that night. The next evening, I came in early. I told myself I was just being paranoid. It was an old cemetery, my mind was playing tricks, and I wasn't used to working alone at night. But part of me wanted to check, to reassure myself. I walked the whole perimeter before my shift started, checking the fences and gates. Everything was locked up. No signs of anyone sneaking in, but something still felt wrong. As I worked, I kept feeling like I was being watched. The back of my neck prickled. I turned suddenly, expecting to see someone standing among the graves, but there was never anything there. That night, I stayed in the maintenance cabin longer than usual, trying to shake the feeling. I sat on the old wooden bench inside, listening to the hum of the wind outside. The cabin had a single overhead light, dim and flickering. The walls were lined with tools, shovels, rakes, hedge trimmers. The smell of gasoline and cut grass hung in the air. I was staring at the wall when I heard it. A noise outside, not the wind. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. They crunched against the gravel path just outside the cabin door. I didn't move. My breath caught in my throat. The footsteps stopped right outside. For a long moment, there was silence. Then the faintest sound of breathing. Just beyond the door, my chest tightened. I stood up as quietly as I could, reaching for the closest thing. A rusted wrench sitting on the work table. Then suddenly 3 sharp knocks. I nearly dropped the wrench. Knock, knock, knock. Hard, solid. I stared at the door. The handle didn't turn. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to get in. They just wanted me to know they were there. I took a slow step forward. My fingers tightened around the wrench. And then silence. No more knocks.
No footsteps.
Nothing. I waited, my ears straining. My own breathing sounded deafening in the quiet. After what felt like forever, I grabbed the flashlight from the shelf and forced myself to open the door. The night air was cold. I swept the flashlight beam across the gravel path. Nobody. I stepped outside, heart hammering, scanning the graves, the trees, the fence line. Nothing. I should have left right then. Quit the job, never looked back. But I didn't. The next few nights were worse. The knocks came again, sometimes at the cabin door, sometimes against the metal storage shed behind it. Always 3 times, always when I was alone. One night, I heard footsteps circling the cabin, slow and steady, crunching against the gravel. I sat inside, wrench in hand, staring at the door, waiting for them to stop. Then, on my last night there, I saw him again. I was locking up the shed when I glanced up toward the tree line. There he was, closer this time. I could see him better now. A man tall, dressed in dark clothes. His face was hard to make out in the low light, but I saw enough. He was smiling, not a friendly smile, not a grin, a thin, stretched smile that sent ice through my veins. I stood frozen, my breath shallow. Then he took a step forward. That broke the spell. I ran. I don't remember getting into my truck. I don't remember starting it. But I remember the way my headlights washed over the graves as I sped out of there. I never went back. I quit the next morning over the phone. Didn't ask for my last paycheck. Didn't explain. Just left it behind. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I knew I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I had never liked snakes. Maybe it was something about the way they moved, silent, calculating, unnatural. I had seen them before, of course. Grew up in a place where rattlesnakes coiled under porches, where water moccasins glided through the creeks like black ribbons. I knew the rules. Stay away. Watch your step. But knowing the rules doesn't always mean you get to follow them. It was early November when I arrived at the cabin. The air was colder than I expected, crisp with the promise of frost. This place wasn't mine. It belonged to my uncle, a man who had long since given up on civilization. He built the cabin out here in the woods, away from everyone because he wanted peace. That's what he told us, anyway. He hadn't been answering his phone. That wasn't unusual. He didn't like technology much, didn't trust it. But after a month of silence, my father asked me to drive out and check on him. Just see if he's okay, he had said. Maybe he just needs help with something. The drive was long, nearly 3 hours from town. Most of it spent on winding dirt roads where the trees leaned in close. I kept the radio off. There was something about the woods that made noise feel out of place. By the time I reached the clearing where the cabin stood, the sun was already sinking low behind the trees. It was smaller than I remembered. The wood darkened with age, the windows smudged with dirt. His truck was parked outside, same as always. The first thing I noticed when I stepped out of my car was the silence.
No birds.
No wind, just the kind of stillness that makes your skin crawl. I walked up to the porch, knocking twice before trying the handle. The door was unlocked. Inside, the cabin smelled wrong. Stale, heavy, like old food and something else underneath it, something I couldn't quite place. Dust floated in the last streaks of sunlight filtering through the window. The place looked normal, mostly. A few dishes in the sink, an open book on the table. But then I saw the chair knocked over near the fireplace, the dark stain on the floorboards beneath it. Something wasn't right. I stepped forward, careful, scanning the room. The stain was dry, old, but it was blood. I knew that much. I moved to the back, past the tiny kitchen, toward the bedroom. The door was shut. My fingers hesitated on the knob before turning it. The smell hit me first. Thick, sickly, rotten. My uncle was there, sprawled across the floor, his face twisted, his skin darkened and bloated. He had been dead a while. I didn't move at first, just stood there, my breath caught in my throat. It didn't make sense. He was healthy, strong for his age. No signs of a struggle, no wounds I could see, just dead. Then I heard it, a rustling, slow, deliberate. I turned my head toward the bed, toward the dark space beneath it. The sound came again, shifting, sliding. Something was under there. I backed away, careful not to step too hard, my heart hammering. And then I saw it, the snake. It was huge, bigger than any I had ever seen. Its thick body coiled in the shadow beneath the bed frame. Its skin was dark, almost black, with a dull sheen that caught the light. It moved slowly, its head lifting just slightly. That's when I saw the lump in its body, the grotesque bulge stretching the scales wide. My stomach turned. I didn't know much about snakes, but I knew enough to recognize what that meant. It had eaten something big. I didn't stay to find out what. I backed out of the room, slow, careful. The floor creaked, and the snake's head jerked slightly, its tongue flickering out. I reached the front door, stepping out onto the porch, breathing hard. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone. No service. Of course not. I had to leave, now. But something held me there, my eyes flicking back to the open doorway. My uncle was dead, had been for days. And that snake, what if? I forced the thought away, heading to my car. The keys were already in my hand when I stopped. The truck, his truck. If he had been here the whole time, then why was it parked outside? Why hadn't he driven for help? Unless I turned back toward the cabin. The setting sun cast long shadows over the porch, the doorway gaping like an open mouth. I didn't want to go back inside. Every instinct told me to leave, to drive until I hit the highway and never look back. But something inside me, maybe guilt, maybe duty, kept me rooted in place. I grabbed the flashlight from my car, flicking it on before stepping back inside. The air was thick with the stench of decay. I kept my distance from the bedroom, scanning the floor, and then I saw it, the second stain, smaller than the one near the fireplace. A few feet away, near the wall, and something else, a drag mark. My stomach clenched. There had been two bodies. I followed the trail with the flashlight, my breath shallow. It led toward the back door, the one that opened to the woods. The door was cracked open. Just slightly, I pushed it wider. Outside, the ground was disturbed. Leaves scattered, dirt shifted, like something had been pulled through. I swallowed hard, shining the light forward. A shape just beyond the tree line. I stepped closer, the beam shaking, and then I saw it. Another body, not my uncle, someone else. Face down, arms stretched, shirt torn. A man. I didn't recognize him. I stumbled back, my mind racing. Who was he? And then the rustling again. Behind me, slow, deliberate. I turned just in time to see the snake. It was closer than before, its thick body sliding across the floorboards of the porch. Its head lifted slightly, watching me. The bulge in its stomach. Too big for a raccoon. Too big for a dog. My uncle was dead inside. That much I knew. But out here, this man, had he been alive when the snake found him? I didn't stay to find out. I ran down the steps, across the clearing, into the car. My hands fumbled with the keys, the engine stalling once before roaring to life. In the rearview mirror, I saw it just for a second. The cabin, dark and still. The door open, and the snake, its body shifting slowly, disappearing back into the shadows. I didn't stop driving until I reached the main road. I called the police, told them everything. They found my uncle where I left him. And the other body, they never found the snake. I never went back. I was 34 when I agreed to watch over my uncle's hunting cabin for a couple of weeks. He had owned the place for years, but I had only been there once before when I was a teenager. It sat deep in the woods, a few miles outside a small town that hardly anyone had heard of. There was no phone service, no internet, and the nearest neighbor was at least 2 miles away. He told me it would be easy. Just check the place, make sure no one had broken in, and keep an eye on things. He had a few traps set up for small game and wanted me to check them every morning. Other than that, I would be alone. I had brought enough supplies to last me the whole time. Cans of food, a couple of gallons of water, and a rifle just in case. The first couple of days were peaceful. The air was fresh. The forest around me was quiet except for the occasional rustling of animals in the brush. I spent my time reading, hiking around the property, and keeping the place tidy. At night, I would light a fire, sit on the porch, and listened to the sounds of the woods. Felt good to be away from everything. But on the third night, things started to change. I had gone to bed early, but something woke me up in the middle of the night. A noise outside. It wasn't an animal, at least it didn't sound like one. It was steady, deliberate. Footsteps. I sat up in bed, holding my breath. The sound came from behind the cabin, where the forest was thick. I reached for my rifle, listening. The footsteps stopped. For a long time, there was nothing but silence. I waited, heart pounding, straining my ears for any sign of movement. After a few minutes, I convinced myself that it had been my imagination. The woods could play tricks on you at night. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I went outside to check around the cabin. I didn't see anything at first, but when I walked around the back, I saw them. Footprints. They were human. They led from the tree line to the back of the cabin and then stopped, just a few feet from the wall. It was like whoever had made them had stood there for a while before turning back. I looked around, scanning the trees, but saw no sign of anyone. I told myself it was probably a hiker who had wandered too close, but I knew that was unlikely. The nearest trail was miles away, and this wasn't the kind of place people just stumbled upon. That night, I locked the doors and kept my rifle close. Just after midnight, the noises started again. This time, it wasn't just footsteps. I heard something moving in the brush, the snapping of twigs, the sound of someone breathing. Came closer, slow and steady. I held my breath, gripping the rifle. Then I heard a light tap on the window. It was soft, almost hesitant. A single knock, then another. I stayed completely still. Whoever was outside didn't knock again. They just stood there. I couldn't see them, I didn't want to move the curtain, but I could feel them there, watching. Minutes passed. Then, finally, I heard the footsteps retreating, fading into the trees. The rest of the night was silent. The next morning, I checked the area again. More footprints. This time, they were right up against the cabin. They had circled the building, stopping at each window. Someone had been watching me. I spent the day trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept the rifle with me at all times. Every noise in the woods made my skin crawl. The quiet that I had enjoyed just days ago now felt oppressive. That night, I didn't sleep. Sometime after midnight, I heard something new. The door handle moved. It wasn't subtle. Whoever was outside was trying to open the door. Slowly, carefully. I held my breath, heart pounding. Then the knocking started again. Soft, deliberate, just like the night before. I raised the rifle, pointing it at the door. The knocking stopped. Then a long silence. And then the footsteps walking away, fading into the woods. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. At dawn, I packed my things. I had agreed to stay for 2 weeks, but I knew I wouldn't last another night. I locked up the cabin, loaded my gear into my truck, and started the long drive back to town. As I left the woods behind, a sense of relief washed over me. But then, just as I was about to merge onto the highway, I looked at the side mirror. There, on the edge of the woods, half hidden behind the trees, was a figure, standing still, watching me. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I never went back to that cabin. And my uncle, when I told him what happened, just shook his head, said he had never seen anything strange out there. Maybe he hadn't, but I know what I saw, and I know that something or someone had been watching me in those woods, and whoever they were, they had wanted to get inside. I don't go into the woods alone anymore, and I never will. I never thought much about the old cabin in the woods. It had been sitting there long before I was born, tucked deep into the forest behind my grandfather's old property. My grandfather used to mention it every now and then, always in passing, just a vague warning to stay away. something about it being abandoned for decades. I never asked questions. As a kid, the woods were my playground, but that cabin was the one place I never ventured near. Years passed. My grandfather passed away, and the property was left to me. By then, I was 36, living in the city, barely even thinking about that land anymore. But life has a way of pushing you back to places you've long left behind. A job loss, a messy breakup. I needed an escape, somewhere quiet, somewhere far from people. The old property seemed perfect. So, I packed up my things and moved into the small house that had once belonged to my grandfather. It was simple but solid, sitting just at the edge of the forest. The air was cleaner out there. The silence was heavy but peaceful. I spent my days fixing up the place, clearing out old junk, making it feel like my own. But the cabin was always in the back of my mind. It wasn't far, just about a 20-minute walk into the woods. The path leading to it was overgrown, barely visible under years of fallen leaves and tangled branches. I told myself I wouldn't go near it. I had no reason to. It was just an old, forgotten structure, probably falling apart. Then, one afternoon, I saw something strange. I had been out chopping wood behind my house when I noticed movement deeper in the woods. Just a flicker, something shifting between the trees. At first, I thought it was a deer, but then I saw a shape tall, human. Someone was standing out there, half hidden in the shadows. I froze, gripping the axe a little tighter. Nobody else lived out here. The closest neighbor was miles away. The figure didn't move. He just stood there, watching. An older man, maybe in his 60s, thin but not frail. He was wearing dark clothes, a jacket that looked worn out, and a hat pulled low over his face. Something about him felt off. I didn't call out to him. Instead, I turned and walked back toward the house, keeping him in my peripheral vision. He never moved, just stood there watching me until I was inside. That night, I barely slept. Every little noise outside made my skin crawl. The woods had always felt peaceful to me, but now they felt like they were closing in. The next day, I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe he was just a hiker who got lost. But a part of me knew that wasn't the case. Nobody came out this far. A few days passed without incident. Then, one evening, I found something strange near the edge of my property. Footprints. Deep, heavy footprints in the dirt, leading from the woods toward my house. They stopped just a few yards from my back door. I checked around the house, but nothing was missing or disturbed. It was like someone had just walked up, stood there for a while, and left. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was the same man. That night, I stayed up late, keeping watch through the window. Hours passed. Then, just after midnight, I saw movement again. The man. He was standing at the tree line, closer this time. He didn't do anything. Didn't move, didn't make a sound. Just stood there, watching. Something in me snapped. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside, aiming the beam toward him. The second the light hit him, he turned and disappeared into the woods, moving fast for someone his age. I didn't chase him. I didn't want to know where he went, but I knew where he had come from, the cabin. The next morning, I made up my mind. I had to see it for myself. The hike to the cabin was harder than I remembered. The forest felt thicker, the air heavier. The closer I got, the more I felt like I was being watched. When I finally saw the cabin, my stomach twisted. It looked worse than I imagined. Half collapsed, roof caving in, walls warped from years of neglect. But someone had been there. I could see footprints leading up to the door, fresh ones, pressed deep into the dirt. I stepped closer. The door was slightly open. Inside, the cabin was a mess. Old furniture, broken glass, papers scattered everywhere. But there were signs of recent activity. Empty food cans, a dirty blanket in the corner. Someone had been living here. Then I saw something that made my blood run cold. Pinned to the wall just above the blanket were photographs, dozens of them, all of me, pictures of me chopping wood, walking near my house, even one of me sleeping taken through my window. I backed out of the cabin, heart pounding, trying to keep my breathing steady. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Someone was coming. I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs nearly gave out. When I reached my house, I locked every door, every window. Then I grabbed my shotgun and sat there, waiting. The man never came. The next morning, I drove straight into town and went to the police. They sent a deputy out to check the cabin. When he came back, he told me something that made my skin crawl. The cabin was empty. No photos, no blanket, no signs that anyone had ever been there. But the footprints were still there, leading up to my house. I didn't stay after that. I packed my things and left. I don't know who that man was or why he was watching me. I don't want to know. All I know is that sometimes, late at night, I still get the feeling that someone is watching. And I never go near old cabins anymore. The rain had started falling just after sunset. It was the kind of rain that soaked everything in an instant, the heavy, endless kind that made the air thick and cold. The forecast had called for light showers, but this was a full-blown storm. The trees swayed violently, and the wind howled as if trying to rip them from the ground. I could hear the raindrops hammering against the roof of the cabin, a steady, unrelenting noise that filled the space like white noise. I had come here to spend the weekend alone. The cabin belonged to my uncle, an old hunting lodge deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest paved road. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small wooden structure with a single bedroom, a kitchen, and a main living area. No television, no internet, just an old radio that crackled with static when I turned it on. There was a fireplace, but I hadn't bothered lighting it yet. I had driven up in the afternoon, my truck now parked outside, half hidden by the trees. The moment I stepped out of the vehicle, I knew I had made a mistake. The air was damp, the kind that seeps into your bones, and the woods felt different. I had been here before plenty of times, but something about it felt off this time. Maybe it was the weather, maybe it was just my imagination, but the quiet wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the kind that made you uneasy, like something was watching. I shook off the feeling and carried my bags inside. The cabin smelled of old wood and damp air, the way it always did when it had been left empty for a while. I checked the pantry and found a few canned goods left over from my uncle's last visit, enough to get me through the weekend if I needed it. I had brought my own supplies anyway, coffee, bread, a few packs of dried food. By the time the rain started, I had settled in. I sat in the chair near the window, watching the storm roll in through the trees. The wind picked up, rattling the window panes, and the darkness outside became absolute. No stars, no moon, just the black outline of trees shifting in the wind. The sound of the rain was constant, a steady drumming that should have been comforting. But as I sat there, something about it started to bother me. It took me a while to realize what it was. The storm was loud, but underneath it, just barely, I could hear something else. A different sound, something that didn't belong. At first, I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe an animal moving through the brush. But the longer I listened, the more certain I became that it wasn't either of those things. It was rhythmic, deliberate. Footsteps. I sat perfectly still, my heart pounding, straining to hear past the rain. It was impossible to tell exactly where the sound was coming from. The storm distorted everything, making it feel like the world outside was shifting, alive in its own way. But I was sure of one thing, whatever it was close. I reached for my flashlight and turned it on, shining it through the window. The beam cut through the rain, lighting up the trees in pale yellow. Nothing, just the woods wet and empty. The moment the light hit the tree line, the sound stopped. I held my breath. I waited. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Then, slowly, I turned off the flashlight. For a long time, I stayed where I was listening, waiting to hear it again. But all I could hear was the rain, the wind, the creaking of the cabin as it shifted in the cold. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been nothing, just a trick of the storm. I went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. I kept waking up, startled by the smallest sounds. The wind against the walls, the branches tapping against the window, my own breathing loud in the silence. At some point, I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, I was awake again, and something was different. The rain had stopped. The sudden quiet was almost worse than the storm. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on me. The cabin felt smaller in the dark, the walls closer than before. Then I heard it again. The footsteps. They were closer now. I sat up, my pulse hammering in my throat. The sound was coming from just outside the cabin, slow and deliberate, moving around the perimeter. Someone or something was circling the building. I reached for the flashlight again, gripping it tight. My hands were sweating. I told myself to be rational, to think. Could be an animal, a deer maybe, but deep down I knew it wasn't. I stood up as quietly as I could and moved toward the window, barely breathing. I didn't turn on the light this time. Instead, I pressed my face close to the glass and tried to see through the darkness. There was nothing there. Then the footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening. I felt my whole body tense, waiting for something to happen. The wind had died down, the trees barely moving. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and heavy in my ears. Then, out of nowhere, something scraped against the wooden wall of the cabin. I jumped back, my stomach twisting. The sound was slow, deliberate, like nails dragging against the wood. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay calm. My uncle kept a rifle in the cabin. I had seen it earlier, propped against the corner near the fireplace. I moved toward it carefully, my movements slow and controlled. I grabbed the rifle and checked the chamber. Loaded. Then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the noise started again. But this time it was at the door. A low, creaking sound, like weight pressing against the wood. The handle rattled once, then went still. I raised the rifle, aiming at the door. My breathing was shallow, my arms tense. The seconds dragged on, stretching into what felt like hours. Then nothing. No more sounds. No more movement. I stayed there, motionless, for what felt like an eternity. The storm had left everything soaked, the air thick with moisture. But outside, whoever had been there was gone. I didn't sleep again that night. By morning, the rain had started again, lighter this time. I stepped outside, my boots sinking into the wet earth. I checked around the cabin, searching for footprints. The ground was soft, muddy. If someone had been walking around, there would be signs. I found them, footprints, deep and clear, circling the cabin. They weren't mine. I didn't wait to find out who had made them. I packed my things, locked up the cabin, and left. I never told my uncle what happened. I never went back. I still don't know who or what was out there that night. But I know one thing for sure. I wasn't alone.